Our next song diverges from our protest song theme here, and it comes from Korean American indie rock band Run River North, who remind me of Far East Movement in that they occupy a genre and overall industry where Asian Americans are pretty underrepresented. I'm listening to their Mumford & Sons-esque tunes inspired by their upbringing as Asian Americans as I write this blurb about the model minority myth. What is the model minority concept? It's a theory created by the white majority in America as a response to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Asians were exploited by white politicians and writers to push the blame for the inequity and lower standards of living that African Americans were experiencing away from institutionalized racism and onto the black community itself, claiming that if African Americans submitted themselves to segregation and discrimination and focused more on education, then they would be able to elevate their own communities out of poverty. What you end up having is this bizarre concept of a, quote, positive stereotype assigned by white people to Asian people with the goal of silencing black people. This only sounds weirder when you consider how less than a century ago the Asian stereotype was that we were poor and uneducated, and you start to feel like your image is being manipulated by an outside party to fit their needs. The emergence of the model minority myth in the 70s and 80s is further undermined by the historical past of America's treatment of Asians. It's a lot, but to run through it quickly, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which explicitly prohibited Chinese from migrating to America and made the ones already here permanently aliens with no possibility for citizenship. This was motivated by anti-competitive sentiment from labor leaders and politicians who blamed them for depressing wage levels. This exclusion was expanded to most parts of Asia in the 1917 Immigration Act before being repealed decades later by the Magnuson Act in 1942, although this was only motivated by our allying with China during World War II. Even then, it only allowed 105 visas for only Chinese people, which was far below the numbers for other primarily white countries. Finally, we saw the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which abolished all racial immigration quotas, and unsurprisingly, we saw an explosion in Asian American immigration after that point. What does this mean? It means there's a high chance that an Asian American you know today is first or second generation. Most likely, their own parents immigrated here, and this is where they grew up. Their roots only extend one or two generations into this nation's soil. Right off the bat, it should feel weird to compare us with, say, Black Americans, who historically came to this country since its founding in chains and on slave boats, and who have been subjected to centuries of broken systems and unequal treatment. Dig deeper and you ask the question, who can immigrate to a different country? It's the people who already have the resources to even consider that possibility, especially when their home country is on the other side of the planet. The dirt poor farmer in rural China or North Korea cannot up and decide to get on a plane and start a new life here. The barriers to come here actually already narrow down the Asian Americans who immigrate here to a higher socioeconomic class, and combined with the ample evidence that a parent's level of education and wealth has significant effects on their children, it helps to explain why Asian Americans appear to be doing so well these days compared to other minorities. The model minority myth might be one of the more controversial subjects I'll refer to in this series, and is probably most deserving of further research. I think it's one of the best examples of how delicate, complex, and nuanced our conversation on race should be, but often fails to be. Some friends of mine are part of a group that produces a podcast called Fresh Off the Vote, which seeks to educate and galvanize young Asian Americans during this election season. Check it out on Spotify.